There is a kind of problem that does not hurt you simply because it exists. It hurts you because it lasts. It stretches itself over time. It lingers. It refuses to leave, and little by little, without asking permission, it starts trying to turn into your identity. You are no longer just dealing with a situation. You begin to see yourself through the lens of that situation. What started as a season slowly starts presenting itself as a definition. And when that happens, faith becomes heavy. Hope becomes expensive, and the question that echoes inside you, quietly but persistently, is always the same. Why doesn't it change for me? Maybe you are listening to this carrying an impossible in your chest. An impossible you once tried to explain to someone, but eventually stopped because it was exhausting to put into words. An impossible you managed to push away during the day, keeping yourself busy, distracted, functional, but that always returns when the house goes quiet and you are left alone with your thoughts. And that is where the battle becomes most intense, because very often it is not the circumstance itself that weighs the most, it is the time, the duration, the slow erosion. The problem is not only the pain, the problem is what the pain is trying to do to you. Pain does not only want to hurt, pain wants to rule. It tries to occupy the center. It tries to govern your expectations. It tries to normalize itself. It tries patiently to convince you that this is just how life is now. And it is exactly here, not at the miracle, not at the climax, that Jesus begins to teach for real. Because Jesus never treated faith as a beautiful speech. He never reduced faith to emotional language or emotional relief. Jesus treated faith as direction. Faith for him was never about what you say with your mouth. It was about what you decide at the center. And if you listen carefully, you will notice something important throughout the Gospels. Jesus is not only healing people, he is teaching people how to leave survival mode and return to inner government. He is restoring authority to the heart. Today, we're going to step into one of the most intense scenes in the Gospels, the woman with the issue of blood. But I need to ask you for something before we begin. Do not listen to this as just another healing story. Listen to it as a lesson. Listen to it as a map. Because there is a detail in this scene that most people overlook, and that detail explains why so many people live near the things of God, hear the word, feel emotional moments, and yet walk away unchanged. And at the end, I will pray with you, not as an emotional ritual, but as a repositioning. Because many people understand with the mind, but something still needs to be affirmed at the core. But before the story even starts, let me place you inside a question, the kind of question Jesus would ask if he were sitting in front of you right now. What has this long-lasting problem done to the way you see yourself? Because the most dangerous suffering is not the one that hurts, it is the one that tries to define you. Jesus taught this constantly, but we often move too fast to notice. He never wanted anything outside of you to occupy the throne inside of you. That is why Scripture says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 2:3. Notice the language, flows, paths, directions. Jesus taught that what happens outside always originates from a center within. The outer road is born from an inner government. Now imagine the scene. Jesus is walking through a narrow street. A crowd presses in from every side, people pushing, calling out, touching him, demanding attention, noise everywhere, urgency everywhere, confusion everywhere. And here is where you need to understand what Jesus is teaching without speaking a single word. The crowd is not just people. The crowd is noise. The crowd is urgency. The crowd is opinion. The crowd is what your mind becomes when it never rests. And many people live exactly like this. On the outside, they are moving forward. On the inside, they are being pushed around. Jesus, as a master teacher, knew this. That is why he taught a principle that is simple but brutal. Before you try to overcome anything out there, you must recover government in here. He did not call it a technique. He called it the secret place. He called it the closed door, because whoever does not close the door ends up being ruled by the noise. And it is in this environment that a woman appears. The text is direct and almost cold, and a certain woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. Mark 5:25. 12 years. That's not a phase. That's not a bad month. That's not a rough season. That's erosion. That is the kind of suffering that drains you slowly, day after day, until it tries to attach a silent label to your soul. And the gospel makes sure to add another layer. She had suffered many things from many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better but rather grew worse. Mark 5:26. In other words, she tried, she paid, she searched, she trusted experts, she exhausted resources, and instead of improving, she deteriorated. Listen carefully how Jesus teaches without preaching. There are things we try to fix using normal means and they don't resolve, and that is where a person risks giving up internally while still remaining alive externally. The body keeps walking, but the heart surrenders. The person begins to accept what should never have been accepted just to survive. And here is something you must see clearly. This woman was not carrying only physical pain. She carried shame, isolation, social exclusion. She carried the feeling of being marked. And this is profoundly human. There are people today living with an invisible hemorrhage, something that drains strength, peace, clarity, hope, and no one sees it. And over time, the person learns a dangerous habit. They learn not to expect anymore. But then comes the turn. The scripture says, when she heard about Jesus. Mark 5:27. Jesus has not touched her yet. Nothing visible has changed, and yet something has already begun. Because Jesus taught all his life that faith begins before the result. Faith begins when a word enters and repositions the center. And later, Paul explains it clearly. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10:17. She heard, and hearing opened a door. But this is where many people misunderstand faith. Many people hear and stop there. They hear and feel something. They hear and admire the idea. But Jesus never taught faith as emotion. He taught faith as movement. The text reveals her secret. For she said, "If I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Mark 5:28. Notice this carefully. She said it. She carried a sentence at the center. She carried an internal direction. She did not say, "Let's see what happens." She said, "If I touch, I will be healed." This is exactly what Jesus calls faith. Not control over God, but alignment of the heart. And now I need to ask you the same way Jesus would, but directly. What sentence do you repeat internally when you think about your impossible? Because everyone has a hidden sentence, and that sentence can either pull you backward or push you forward. Most people think that sentence is me, but often it is just pain speaking loudly. Now comes the part that changes everything. She came in the crowd. Mark 5:27, which means pressure, noise, fear, shame, risk. And here is the lesson of the Master. Faith that transforms does not grow in perfect environments. It is forged in pressure. And this is where many people fail, because they want change without crossing. They want miracles without risk, results without exposure. She touches him, and immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. Mark 5:29. She felt it. The source stopped. The body recognized it. The impossible yielded. And here, the story could end if it were only about healing. She could disappear. She could return home silently. She could carry the miracle in secret. But Jesus does not allow it. And now we arrive at the detail almost no one notices. The detail that explains why so many lives do not change. Jesus stops and asks, "Who touched my clothes?" Mark 5:30. The disciples respond logically. You see the multitude pressing you, and you say, "Who touched me?" In other words, Jesus, everyone is touching you. And here, Jesus is teaching through a question, not because he lacks information, but because he wants to reveal a difference. He wants to separate two things that look identical, but are not. And this difference explains why so many people live close and remain unchanged. The woman comes forward, trembling, afraid, and tells him the whole truth. And Jesus seals it. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." He does not call her woman, he calls her daughter. He heals not only the body, he restores identity. He heals the place where suffering tried to write a name. And here is the reason Jesus did not allow anonymous healing. Because there is a way of being close that does not transform anyone. And Jesus exposed this without a sermon, only with a question in the middle of the road. But this is only the beginning, because now the teaching becomes uncomfortable. And from this point forward, the gospel stops being inspirational and starts being surgical. This is where the scene becomes dangerous. Not dangerous for Jesus, but dangerous for the way many people live their spiritual lives. Because Jesus stops in the middle of urgency. He interrupts momentum. He pauses the mission. Jairus is waiting. A child is dying. Time matters. And yet Jesus stops and asks a question that seems almost irresponsible. "Who touched me?" The disciples respond logically. "Teacher, look at the crowd. Everyone is pressing you." And Jesus doesn't argue with them. He doesn't deny the pressure. He simply refuses to confuse proximity with transformation. This is one of the hardest truths in the gospel. You can be close and unchanged. You can be present and untouched. You can hear everything and remain the same inside. Because pressing is not touching. The crowd pressed Jesus. They leaned on him. They surrounded him. They occupied physical space near him. But nothing happened to them. No healing, no restoration, no identity shift. Why? Because the crowd had contact without direction. They were reacting, not intentional. They were emotionally stimulated, but not inwardly governed. And this is where Jesus exposes a spiritual law that many people resist. Transformation does not come from environment, it comes from intention. The woman did not touch Jesus accidentally. She did not brush against him. She did not bump into him. She came with alignment. She carried a sentence. She carried a decision. She carried direction. If I touch him, I will be healed. And now Jesus forces visibility. The text says she came forward fearing and trembling. Why? Because healing her body was easy. Healing her relationship with visibility was not. For 12 years, she had learned how to disappear. For 12 years, she survived by hiding. For 12 years, her safety was anonymity. And now, Jesus asks her to do the one thing pain trained her not to do, because there is a hidden fear greater than pain. The fear of being restored and having to live differently. Pain becomes familiar. Hiding becomes comfortable. Survival becomes routine. And Jesus refuses to leave her in that posture. He does not shame her. He does not expose her harshly, but he does not allow her to retreat either. She comes forward and tells him the whole truth. That phrase matters. The whole truth. Not a summary, not a spiritualized version, not a clean testimony. Truth. Because truth dismantles false government. Truth removes the crown from shame. Truth removes authority from fear. Truth breaks the narrative suffering built. And this is why Jesus responds the way he does. Daughter. This word is not poetic. It is not emotional. It is structural. Jesus is reassigning identity. Pain tried to name her. Time tried to define her. Isolation tried to label her. Jesus overrides all of it with one word: daughter. Belonging, position, place. And now you must see something crucial. Jesus did not say, "My power healed you." He said, "Your faith has made you well." Why? Because Jesus is not just solving a moment, he is teaching a pattern. He wants her to understand what happened inside her that allowed what happened outside her. If the miracle remained anonymous, she would walk away healed but uninstructed, restored but untrained, free but unaware. And that is dangerous. Because people who do not understand the path will try to repeat the result without the alignment. Jesus does not want superstition. He wants formation. This is why he interrupts the crowd. This is why he exposes the difference. And now this teaching turns toward you. Because many people ask the same question over and over. Why doesn't it change for me? And often the answer is uncomfortable. Because change does not come from touching religious moments. It comes from shifting inner government. You may pray, you may attend, you may listen, but if the center remains ruled by fear, anxiety, shame, or appearance, nothing sustains. The crowd felt Jesus. The woman aligned with him. The crowd reacted. The woman decided. The crowd pressed from outside. The woman touched from the center. And now comes a principle Jesus taught repeatedly but rarely explained directly. Whoever does not govern the inside will always be governed by the outside. This is why Jesus taught about the secret place. This is why he spoke about closing the door. This is why he warned against living for appearances. Because noise is persuasive. Noise rushes you. Noise exhausts you. Noise convinces you to conclude too early. And many people give authority to the noise without realizing it. They say things like, "It didn't work. It's taking too long. Nothing happened. This is just how it is." And those sentences quietly become law inside them. But Jesus teaches a different posture. He teaches persistence without anxiety. He teaches direction without panic. He teaches trust without denial of reality. That is why he said, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." John chapter 7, verse 24. Appearance speaks loudly. Appearance demands conclusions. Appearance pressures decisions. But righteous judgment comes from alignment, not urgency. And this is where many people fall back into the crowd. They touch today, and tomorrow they hand the throne back to anxiety. They pray once, and then spend days monitoring fear. They hear a word, and then repeat the old sentence internally. And this cycle keeps repeating. Jesus warned against this silently, but clearly. Because faith is not proven by a moment. Faith is proven by sustained direction. That is why he taught parables about persistence. That is why he spoke of praying without giving up. That is why he emphasized endurance. Not because God is slow, but because inner government must be stabilized. Now here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Many lives remain stuck not because God does not act, but because people continue living as a crowd internally, even while following externally. They are close but divided, near but noisy, present but scattered. And Jesus does not negotiate with that posture. He invites you out of it. The woman did not receive healing because she was desperate. She received healing because she was aligned. Desperation alone does not move faith. Alignment does. And alignment always produces movement. Which leads us to the next critical point. Jesus never taught faith as passive waiting. He taught faith as responsive movement. Ask, seek, knock. Movement. Not agitation, not striving, not panic. Direction. And here is where many people misunderstand patience. Patience is not inactivity. Patience is sustained alignment over time. The woman waited 12 years, but when alignment came, movement followed immediately. She did not hesitate. She did not negotiate with fear. She moved through the crowd. And that movement cost her something. Risk, exposure, visibility. And Jesus honors that cost, because movement proves where the center truly is. Now let me bring this into your daily life very clearly. There are two ways to live your spiritual life. The first is as a crowd member. You hear messages, you feel emotions, you agree intellectually, but your decisions are still governed by fear. Your reactions are still driven by urgency. Your conclusions are still dictated by appearance. You live monitoring the problem. When things go well, you relax. When things go wrong, you collapse. That is crowd life. The second way is as a disciple. You hear a word and it becomes law inside you. You align your speech, your reactions, your posture. You move with intention, not impulse. You still feel fear, but it does not govern you. You still see difficulty, but it does not define you. This is what Jesus models in this scene. He is not impressed by proximity. He responds to alignment. And now comes a question that cuts deeply. How many times have you been close but internally divided? How many times have you touched environments without touching direction? How many times have you hoped for change without leaving hiding? Because hiding is not neutral. Hiding preserves pain. Jesus did not expose the woman to shame her. He exposed her to free her. Because freedom requires truth, and truth requires visibility. Now here is the most subtle and dangerous misunderstanding. Many people think the difference between pressing and touching is intensity. More emotion, more effort, more desperation. But Jesus shows it is something else entirely. It is alignment of intention. The crowd pressed with bodies. The woman touched with direction. And direction always begins with an inner sentence. What sentence governs you? When things delay, what do you say inside? When nothing changes, what conclusion forms? When fear rises, what becomes law? Because whatever sentence rules you will shape your movement. And Jesus is teaching something precise here. If you do not intentionally replace the internal sentence, pain will keep writing it for you. The woman replaced hers. She did not say, "This never works." She did not say, "I am like this." She did not say, "It's too late." She said, "If I touch him, I will be healed." That sentence carried her through the crowd, and that sentence still teaches today. But this is not the end of the lesson, because now Jesus shifts from healing to formation. And this is where many people stop listening, because formation requires responsibility. Healing can happen in a moment. Formation requires agreement over time. And Jesus always prioritizes formation, which is why he refused anonymous miracles, which is why he called her daughter, which is why he sent her away with peace, not excitement. Peace is stability. Peace is government restored. Peace is noise silenced. At this point in the story, many people believe they already understand everything. A woman had faith, she touched Jesus, she was healed. End of story. But Jesus never allowed his stories to end where people wanted them to end. Because if the story stopped at the healing, we would learn about power, but not about transformation. And Jesus was never primarily concerned with moments. He was concerned with formation. This is why he refused anonymous miracles. An anonymous miracle creates relief without responsibility. It creates gratitude without direction. It creates a story without a path. And Jesus does not want people to live dependent on events. He wants people trained in alignment. That is why he interrupts the flow. That is why he demands visibility. That is why he asks a question he already knows the answer to. Who touched me? This question is not about identification, it is about invitation. Jesus is inviting the woman to step out of a posture that kept her alive but never free. Survival is not freedom. Relief is not restoration. Healing without identity is incomplete. And this is where the gospel becomes deeply uncomfortable, because Jesus exposes a hidden preference many people carry: the preference to remain invisible. Invisibility feels safe. Invisibility avoids responsibility. Invisibility allows you to benefit without being seen. And pain trains people to love invisibility. For 12 years, this woman survived by staying unnoticed, by avoiding exposure, by learning where not to stand. And now Jesus invites her into the opposite posture, not loudly, not aggressively, but firmly. She comes forward, fearing and trembling. That detail matters. Fear did not disqualify her. Trembling did not cancel faith. She moved while afraid. And this is a critical lesson. Faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is movement in spite of fear. Many people wait to feel safe before they move. Jesus teaches the opposite. Movement creates safety. Alignment precedes comfort. And now when she speaks, the text says, she told him the whole truth. This is not small talk. This is confession. And confession is not religious performance. Confession is the breaking of internal secrecy. What is hidden governs you. What is exposed loses authority. This is why Jesus repeatedly emphasized truth. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Not information, truth. Truth dismantles false identity. Truth interrupts inner narratives. Truth pulls you out of survival mode. And now Jesus speaks again. Daughter. This is the first time she is publicly addressed not by her condition, but by her position. This is not symbolic language. This is legal language. Jesus is reinstating her place. Pain tried to exile her. Religion may have isolated her. Society may have rejected her. Jesus restores belonging. And then he says something even more precise. Your faith has made you well. The original language here does not only mean physical healing, it implies wholeness, completion, restoration. And this is why Jesus adds, go in peace. Peace is not just calm. Peace is order restored. Peace is the end of internal war. Peace is the return of rightful government. And now everything becomes clearer. Jesus was not just stopping for her, he was teaching everyone watching. He was showing that the kingdom does not respond to proximity, it responds to alignment. He was dismantling the illusion that being near holy things automatically changes people. And this illusion is still alive today. People attend, people listen, people agree, but they do not shift center. They do not replace the internal sentence. They do not leave hiding. They do not change posture. And then they ask, why doesn't it change? And Jesus answers, not with explanation, but with example. Because change is not activated by intensity. It is activated by agreement. Agreement with truth. Agreement with direction. Agreement with movement. This is why Jesus consistently taught against living by appearances. Because appearance is a tyrant. Appearance tells you what seems obvious. Appearance pressures conclusions. Appearance demands immediate interpretation. But Jesus teaches restraint. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Righteous judgment is not denial of reality. It is refusal to surrender authority to what is incomplete. And this is where many people fail silently. They touch once, and then hand the throne back to fear. They move once, and then return to hiding. They speak faith, and then internally narrate defeat. And this inner contradiction cancels sustainability. Jesus did not want this woman healed temporarily. He wanted her transformed permanently. That is why he forced a pause, because pauses reveal centers. When life slows down, what governs you becomes visible. When urgency stops, the true sentence emerges. And Jesus wanted to expose that sentence and replace it. Now here is where this teaching becomes deeply personal. There are people listening who have touched moments, services, prayers, messages, but remain unchanged. Not because they lack faith, but because they refuse exposure. They want change without truth, healing without confession, relief without responsibility. And Jesus does not work that way. Not because he is harsh, but because he is complete. He heals the body, he restores identity, he reforms posture. And now comes the uncomfortable realization. Sometimes the thing that keeps you stuck is not the pain, it is the hiding. Hiding preserves identity confusion. Hiding maintains old narratives. Hiding keeps fear in power. And Jesus disrupts hiding. He does not do it violently. He does it intentionally. Now let me show you something subtle. Jesus did not expose her to the crowd. He exposed her before him. The crowd witnessed, but Jesus addressed. This matters. True exposure is not public humiliation. True exposure is honest alignment before God. And when that alignment happens, identity shifts. Now, many people misunderstand what it means to step out. They imagine dramatic gestures, public declarations, radical moves. But Jesus shows something different. Stepping out begins with telling the truth. The truth about how long it has lasted. The truth about how much it drained. The truth about what it made you believe about yourself. And this truth breaks the power of the old sentence. Because as long as the old sentence remains unchallenged, it governs. I am like this. It never changes. This is who I am now. Jesus interrupts that with one word, daughter. And that word begins a re-education. Re-education of identity, re-education of posture, re-education of expectation. Now, this leads us to an essential principle. Identity precedes behavior. If you believe you are broken, you live broken. If you believe you are hidden, you remain hidden. If you believe you are restored, you begin to live restored. And Jesus insists on correcting identity before allowing the story to end. Because if identity is not corrected, behavior will revert. This is why many people experience cycles. They touch, they feel better, they revert. Not because the miracle was false, but because the center was never stabilized. Jesus stabilizes centers, and he does it through truth, exposure, and naming. Now, there is another layer here that most people miss. Jesus did not expose her to her theology. He asked her to tell the truth. Because transformation does not begin with correct language. It begins with honest alignment. And honesty costs something. It costs comfort. It costs invisibility. It costs control. But it produces peace. And peace is the sign that government has been restored. Now, before we move forward, you need to sit with this question. Where have you accepted hiding as normal? Where have you confused survival with freedom? Where have you been pressing without touching? Because Jesus is still asking the same question today. Who touched me? Not to accuse, but to invite. An invitation out of noise, an invitation out of anonymity, an invitation into alignment. And the next part of this teaching moves from understanding into application. Because Jesus never taught without a path. He always showed how to live this alignment daily, not emotionally, but practically. And this is where many people resist, because application removes excuses. Now we arrive at the point where Jesus' teaching stops being observed and starts being confronted. Because everything we have seen so far leads to one unavoidable truth. Jesus never separated miracle from mastery. He did not come only to solve moments, he came to train hearts. And that is why this story cannot end with healing alone. Because if it does, the listener remains impressed, but unchanged. Jesus is not impressed by amazement. He is committed to formation. And this is where the real question finally emerges, not spoken out loud, but felt internally. Why do some people experience real, lasting change, while others keep cycling through moments that never settle? The answer is not power. The answer is not access. The answer is not even faith in the way most people understand it. The answer is government. Who governs the center? Jesus made this unmistakably clear in this scene. The woman did not only touch Jesus, she shifted authority. For 12 years, her life had been governed by loss, limitation, and adaptation. She learned how to live around pain, how to schedule life around weakness, how to reduce expectation to avoid disappointment. That is survival mode. And survival mode is not sinful, but it is not the kingdom. Jesus never invited people merely to survive. He invited them to follow. And following is directional. That is why Jesus did not allow her to leave anonymously. Because anonymous healing would have allowed her to go back to the same internal structure, just with less pain. And that would not be freedom. Freedom is not the absence of pain. Freedom is the restoration of authority. That is why Jesus spoke peace over her. Peace is not emotional calm. Peace is order. Peace is when the heart is no longer ruled by urgency, fear, or appearance. Peace is when the center returns to its rightful place. And now this teaching turns fully toward your life. Because many people sincerely love God, but live internally disorganized. They believe, but remain governed by anxiety. They pray, but still conclude by fear. They hope, but still decide by appearance. And Jesus confronts this gently but firmly. Not by condemning, but by calling, "Who touched me?" In other words, who came with alignment? Who came with intention? Who came ready to leave hiding? Because touching Jesus is not about proximity. It is about posture. And posture always produces pattern. Now here is the critical shift that changes everything. Most people think the goal is the miracle. Jesus shows that the goal is governance. The miracle is often the entry point, not the destination. If your center does not change, your life will reorganize itself back into old patterns even after divine intervention. This is why many people say, "I was doing so well and then I fell back." What they really mean is, "I touched, but I did not restructure my center." Jesus restructures centers. And he does it through 3 movements, always in the same order. Not techniques, not formulas, movements. And this is where the gospel becomes practical without becoming shallow. First movement, focus, reclaiming the center. Jesus taught this clearly when he said, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything flows from it." Guarding the heart is not emotional suppression, it is intentional focus. Whatever receives your attention receives authority. And most people do not lose faith, they lose focus. They allow the problem to occupy the center. They allow fear to narrate reality. They allow urgency to dictate interpretation. For 7 days, not forever, not dramatically, simply intentionally, you reclaim the center. Before the noise begins, before messages, demands, and comparisons. 2 minutes. Not to impress God, but to dethrone noise. You choose one sentence of truth and let it sit at the center. Not 10 verses, not a study, a center. Examples Jesus himself lived by. Do not fear, only believe. Seek first the kingdom. Guard your heart. When the mind wanders, you return. Returning is governance. Returning is discipline. Returning is discipleship. Second movement, word. Replacing the internal sentence. The woman had a sentence. If I touch him, I will be healed. That sentence carried her through resistance. Everyone has a sentence. The question is not whether you have one, it is whether you chose it. For many people, pain chose it. It never changes. This is who I am. I always lose. There is no way out. These sentences feel honest, but they are not neutral. They shape posture. They guide decisions. They limit movement. For 7 days, you interrupt that sentence. Not with denial, with redirection. You stop defining yourself by what drains you. Instead of nothing changes, you say, God is teaching me direction. Instead of this is who I am, you say, this is not my name. Instead of it's too late, you say, show me the next step. Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Speech reveals government. Change the sentence and the atmosphere shifts. Third movement, action. Leaving crowd mode. Jesus never taught faith without movement. Ask, seek, knock. Movement proves alignment. For 7 days, choose one real action per day, small but concrete. Not symbolic, not emotional. Something that breaks hiding. A conversation you avoid. A boundary you delay. A discipline you abandoned. A request for help you resist. A habit you need to cut. A step you keep postponing. Not size, direction. Because direction trains the heart to obey truth instead of fear. And now comes the most important warning Jesus silently gives in this story. The invisible error that cancels everything. The invisible error is returning authority to appearance. You touch today, and tomorrow you conclude by what you see. You pray today, and tomorrow you interpret life by fear. You align today, and tomorrow you surrender to urgency. Jesus warned against this clearly. Do not judge by appearance. Appearance lies by being incomplete. It tells you nothing is happening while formation is underway. To conclude early is to abandon government. Faith is not pretending nothing is wrong. Faith is refusing to give authority to what is unfinished. This is why Jesus taught persistence, not anxiety. Persistence is staying aligned when time tries to convince you to stop. Now this brings us to the final revelation of the story. Many people are not stuck because God is silent. They are stuck because they continue living internally as a crowd. Reactive, noisy, divided. Jesus invites you out of that posture. Not into perfection, but into direction. The woman was not perfect. She was afraid. She was trembling, but she moved. And Jesus honored movement governed by truth. Now we close where we began, with identity. Jesus did not say, you are healed. He said, daughter. Because healing without identity restoration is incomplete. You are not your problem. You are not your delay. You are not your exhaustion. You are not the thing that lasted too long. And Jesus refuses to let suffering name you. That is why this teaching exists, not to inspire, but to reposition. And now, as promised, we seal this not with emotion, but with conscious agreement. A prayer of repositioning. Father, in the name of Jesus, I place before you this person who is tired of carrying something that lasts. The time, the erosion, the silent nights, and the hidden sentences. Today, we are not asking only for relief. We are asking for restoration of government. Teach this person to guard their heart because from it flow the paths of life. Teach them not to judge by appearance, but by truth. Give them courage to move even while trembling. Break the power of hiding. Silence the noise. Replace the old sentence with direction. Where there has been draining, let there be closure. Where there has been shame, restore identity. Where there has been fear, establish peace. And let Jesus speak again. Son, daughter, and let peace replace noise. In Jesus' name, amen. Now the response is simple. Not a promise, not a vow, a decision. If this teaching resonated, do not respond emotionally. Respond directionally. Decide to touch. Decide to leave crowd mode. Decide to reclaim the center. Because when the center is restored, life begins to obey.